This is CHAOSScast, the Chaos community podcast where we share use cases and experiences with measuring open source community health, elevating conversations about metrics, analytics, and software from the Community Health Analytics open source software, or short Chaos project, to wherever you like to listen. Welcome to this episode.
So I'm Patrick Woods. I am co-founder and CEO of a company called Orbit's Mission Control for Your Community. So we help companies that have distributed communities understand what's going on across their constellation of different platforms to better serve their community and to understand what's going on. Orbit's based on this concept called the Orbit model, which we'll dive into today, which is essentially an open framework for measuring and assessing how communities are growing or contracting over time.
Maybe you can talk a little bit more about the foundations of the Orbit model and what it looks like in practice.
So the Orbit model has a few central components. There are gravity, love, reach, and orbit level. And so these we think represent different aspects of a community member's journey with a community. Again, I would preface this by saying it's not perfect. And we welcome comment and contribution. The Orbit model is on GitHub, and we've had a number of pull requests and updates and requests for comment over time. So it's an evolution. And so starting from the sort of maybe the bottom of the measurement stack, if you will, love and reach are sort of the two main components we talk a lot about. Reach is an easy one. It's basically an individual's influence. This can be measured by number of Twitter followers or number of newsletter subscribers. But the idea is that you just want to know how influential is a person, because when we think about gravity, which we'll talk about in a moment, it's probably self-evident, but gravity is an attractive force. And if someone's got a lot of reach, they probably have the ability to pull people in. But the second component of the Orbit model is what we call love. And it's a fun word. We chose it specifically to maybe differentiate or complement terms like engagement, which are sort of fraught with maybe marketing baggage or social media measurement baggage, things like that. Love is really the recency, frequency, and quality of a person's contribution in your community. And the recency and frequency are probably fairly obvious, like how often does this person participate and when's the last time they did a thing, basically. And then the quality is a little bit more nebulous, but it's this idea that someone, retweeting your content is nice, but it's fundamentally different than someone keynoting your conference. And so if you can essentially create a manifest of activities across the community, you can start to understand the size and shape of the contribution. I guess the underlying assumption here is that one hallmark of a healthy community is one that's active. Time is a component as well. And this is the idea that an activity in your community or contribution today is kind of worth more than one that was done a year or 2 years or more years ago, and says a lot more about a person's engagement, to use that term, essentially their willingness to participate more if they're more active more recently. And so what you could do with the Orbit model math is basically discount activities that happened a long time ago. And so now you actually have a couple of different constituent components that you're measuring. So you can, on one hand, sort your community by like total number of activities, which is interesting. Like here's a manifest top to bottom of who's done the most stuff. But if you start to factor in time, you can start to filter and sort your community by their relative love. If you understand someone's love, you can bucket them into different orbit levels. And the purpose of the orbit level segmentation is to basically help you as the community manager prioritize, one, how to spend time with your community, but two, what offers to make to each person.
So if you don't mind, can you go over a little bit of the other prior models that community managers have used and compare it to this orbit analogy? What makes the orbit analogy more attractive and more efficient and effective in defining the customer value journey and the community member journey of your organizations?
I have to suspect maybe the both of you have a lot more context on a lot more models too. So happy to make this a collaborative discussion, comparing and contrasting. I would start by saying that one thing that we think a lot about with the orbit model and maybe have thought about since the beginning is trying to make it a tool, not just for like a conceptual discussion, but like a tool for actually acting and using it. So there's a lot of models that say like, oh, there's a progression of casual people to more engaged people.
Yeah, and like the leverage relationship model.
Yeah. So there's a lot of, I guess, sort of frameworks for, and I need to refine my thinking on this a bit, I think, but like discussing and categorizing and like a taxonomy that helps frame up a conceptual area maybe, but I don't know that all models are really actionable and tools for like tactical implementation. So The one thing we try to do with the orbit model, not sure if it gets there or not, but it's like, if you start to apply these principles, you can start to actually do something about it. And if you're keeping up with the people who are high love in your community, for example, and tracking that over time, you probably start to see some trends and reach out to people who are starting to churn out of the community, or you start to notice people who are new to the community, but are doing a lot of stuff and like their love increases really quickly. And so you can think about essentially behavioral segmentation and how you deliver value to each of those segments of the community.
Can you talk a little bit about how a person's interaction over time and the measurement, how that love decays, can kind of tell you where they are in that path?
Yeah, so I love these insights and thank you for sharing. It's always fun to go deep on these ideas with folks. And I agree that like the gravity metaphor is just, it lends itself to so many other metaphors. I'm a metaphor fan. So yes. All right. So to answer the question, I would say a couple of things. So the specific relationship, just to be honest, the relationship between love and orbit level is something that's like constantly a thing we're riffing on and trying to perfect. I'll share a little bit about some upcoming proposed changes to the orbit model, which is kind of interesting. And so today in the orbit model, orbit level changes based on love. And so as love decays, conceptually that the community member floats back out to, from the near orbit 1 to orbit 4. We realized, kind of going back to first principles, that let's just say you had a community member that was in your orbit 1, you knew them very well. And then for whatever reason, over the course of a year, their love decayed to little or nothing. As soon as they re-engage, they're going to be back in your orbit 1. And you're not going to say, well, you're just some random person. The reality of how you would treat them as a community builder is pretty similar. And so what we're doing is actually, we're thinking of orbit level attainment almost like as benchmarks. You're not going to drift out in your orbit level, but the love will go down over time. And so this starts to lead to some interesting ways to slice and dice the data. For example, you could imagine a world where there's a segment of your community that is in orbit 1. So you know that they at some point were one of your VIPs, but their recency and frequency have gone down to nothing. So their love is very little. And so the playbook for that segment of the community, you might have a specific program built around just re-engaging those churned orbit 1 members. And so we think about these sort of the metrics as a group and how they can tell you different things about a person's relationship to the community. You could have a person in orbit 3 or 4 whose frequency and recency are like picking up. And you're like, oh, these are like rising stars. These are people who they're brand new. What is the next step for onboarding them and providing them with resources and opportunities to do stuff in the community?
Do you have some insights from those users of the orbit model? Have you seen some pitfalls or maybe even success stories?
So the pitfalls are probably mostly on us and product related. Things like putting orbit model charts into orbit the product and people not knowing about the orbit model. And they're like, what is love? What is gravity? Like, what do these charts mean? And just like, classic, just like user experience misses.
Yeah.
It's just like, we're like, oh, everyone that's using orbit knows about the orbit model too. And it turns out they do not. So that's been a fun, brand and user experience. So that's been fun. So that's an ongoing challenge, I would say, from a product design standpoint, is to share these insights, these ideas in a way that are familiar to people.
And I think that's probably another one of those pain points that other models just refuse to approach. Is you can have a model, you can place people into a specific stage, you can say this is where they're at, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there is an action on your end that will elicit a greater behavior. And I really like that the orbit model actually sets up week over week benchmarks that say, you're a little low here, you're a little high here. How can you convert from high stat A to low stat B? I think that's incredible. And it kind of gives community managers direction in the data by telling that story in a way that seems more active.
Yeah, totally. And what we're seeing is that it starts to facilitate really interesting conversations between community leaders, like from different communities. So now you can start to have a conversation, like, what are you doing with your orbit level 1? Like what are your programs, or how are you engaging people that are drifting away? Like, you've got this cohort of people that had a lot of love 6 months ago, and now they're like dropping really fast. Do you have any ideas or programs or anything that's worked for your community that works to re-engage those folks? Or how do you prioritize spending your time? Are you spending most of your time on the champions or the people in orbit 4? Or like, what's the distribution of like how you allocate resources for your community? So yeah, a big part of what we try to do is just provide more granular language for people to talk about these concepts versus like, I think without the vocabulary of something like the orbit model, you're just saying like, well, like what tactics you're using to like grow your community, which is like super high level. But with the sort of constituent components of the orbit model, we're finding it leads to a lot more specific discussion between folks building communities.
Maybe another question I have is, what kind of communities do you see the orbit model being applied to? Because in CHAOSS, we very much talk about and care about the health of open source communities. And so we always involve the community. We have leaderboards, we have public dashboards, we report on these metrics in conference talks. And so there is always this level of transparency and dialogue that we want with the community. And so I just wanted to see, how have you seen the orbit model being used in those conversations?
Yeah, so I'll answer your question a couple of ways, I think. So, one question you asked was what types of communities are thinking about and applying the orbit model. We were definitely born in the world of developer communities. Like that's our DNA. On the orbit product side of things, like GitHub was the first integration we shipped. So we're very much coming out of developer world. A number of reasons for that. It's a mature space. There's lots of communities with lots of data about them. So we started there. And that's also kind of where we're from. What's interesting as the orbit model matures, the scope of its awareness has expanded somewhat, not like a huge amount, I would say. I don't want to overpromise here, but I think, what we're hearing is open source communities, developer communities are kind of like the early adopters of the framework, but we're having folks come and ask us questions from someone was talking about music communities and like how to like measure your band's community. We are seeing a lot of adoption in like gaming and crypto, and then sort of adjacent communities like no code, low code folks, and like independent community builders. So like folks who have like a paid newsletter and a Slack group and things like that, they're applying the model too. And we think that's probably a reasonable maturation of the concepts, because we started with developer world, but really if you're running any community, you kind of want to know like who's in the community, what are they doing, how is it changing over time? It doesn't matter if it's a developer or a band super fan. Orbit, the company, has been around for about 18 months. We, as mentioned, built it to implement orbit model concepts at scale, but also to help companies answer this sort of fundamental question that we saw in the consulting practice, which was like, I've got all these people out there in the community, but I have no idea what's working and what's not. I can't tell what's working. So, we think about it as mission control for your community. So plug in any of your data sources, like your forums, your chat, your event platforms, even your product analytics, if you'd like, and get that single timeline view of at the individual level, how someone's moving in and out of your community and your product, and then the ability to zoom out and see metrics at a high level. Baked into that is a lot of insights around, here are rising stars, here are people that are churning, some of that stuff we were talking about with the orbit model, using a combination of orbit level and recency and frequency and quality to have these behavioral segments such that your team can then act on that data and implement those playbooks. We have some pretty cool stuff around webhooks in the API too. So you can basically say, it's almost like if this, then that for your community. So if someone asks a question in the forum and they have the tag VIP, send me a DM in Slack, or fire a webhook over to HubSpot to update their record in the CRM, things like that.
And thank you, dear listener, for joining us today. To stay up to date on future episodes, subscribe for free to this podcast on your favorite podcast app. Share this episode with your friends and colleagues. If you have ideas for future episode topics or would even like to come on as a guest, please email us, podcast@chaoss.community. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Until next time, your CHAOSS community.